Dankjewel. Dankjewel. Thank you. I hope I didn't disappoint anyone. This is not about CSV. It's a new YAML. Just joking. I know. CSV is amazing. I know. I love it. I think I switched it on. I'm pretty sure. Now, this is about testing your user interfaces in the real browser with Storybook. So this is something I've been working on for the past couple of months, and I'm really excited to show you this. I'm Gert Hengeveld. I'm a software engineer with Chromatic. Chromatic is an American company. It's a Silicon Valley startup. I work on Chromatic, which is a SaaS platform for visual regression testing. Basically, we take screenshots of your user interface components and compare them over time so that you don't make mistakes. So you change some styling somewhere and it bubbles up somewhere in an unexpected place. We will know and show and tell you that you made that mistake. But we also work on Storybook. Chromatic is built on top of Storybook, and so Storybook is very important to us. Storybook is actually an open source project, and we spend a lot of time improving Storybook as well. If you'd love to know more about that, follow me on Twitter. I occasionally send a tweet about stuff like that. So, user interfaces these days, in case you're not familiar, not aware, are built using components. All of the major front-end frameworks or libraries, such as React, Angular, Vue, they all use components as the base node, so to say, in the entire structure. You then build up your user interfaces from those components, and the whole idea there is that components are reusable. So you have to spend less time reinventing the wheel all the time because you can reuse the same component over and over again. Even classic server-side frameworks such as Ruby on Rails and Laravel, they all are also jumping on this component-driven development bandwagon. And a big part in this whole ecosystem is Storybook. But before I dive in there, I want to talk about the state of UI testing. So user interface testing it's really hard, and the problems are that your app that you might be testing, it's got some data, loading data from a database or data warehouse even, and that data can be flaky. It might need data to send data over the wire, and what's more is reproducing a certain state in your app is pretty hard to do. You have to deal with complex business logic. Your components, like front ends and user interfaces are getting more and more complex all the time. More and more stuff is happening in that front end these days because people expect rich user interactions, right? But testing all of the various states that your app can have is very challenging, and something that you definitely don't want to do manually. And we are dealing with the wrong tools. There are tools to test user interfaces, and in fact, the front-end framework authors are doing a really good job to try to make it easier as they go along and release new versions. And there are systems in the ecosystem to allow you to test those user interfaces. But it's kind of weird that the status quo of testing user interfaces or user interface components is actually to test them in Node.js with JS DOM, which isn't actually a real browser, which is kind of weird because your user interface components will end up running in the browser or on mobile, but that's a different story. So Storybook, that's where Storybook comes in. So Storybook, in case you're not aware, Storybook is a tool for building front-end components, for building UI components faster and easier. The way it does that is it allows you to build user interface components in isolation, meaning you can focus on that one button that you are building, or that one form that you are building, or a single page that you're building. But the gist is you don't have to deal with the surrounding state of an application wherein that component is eventually going to live. It allows you to organize your work by cataloging all the various components that you have in your system and all of the states that those components can be in. You can use Storybook to test and document your components so that it becomes they are more resilient to change and they are easier to reuse by other people on your team or other teams even, or maybe even people in the world. So take, for example, Stripe. They release user interface components that other developers can just drop in their web app so that they can enable payments in their system. Obviously, those components need to be really battle hardened and tested and documented so that they are integrated in other people's apps correctly and reliably. And finally, Storybook allows you to improve the workflow that you have with your team. So that means collaborating with designers, collaborating with backend developers, collaborating with other stakeholders, management, etc. And the way that Storybook does that is by enabling you to build those components in isolation. So you don't need to look at this code example per se, but what's important here is that this is the user interface of Storybook. Storybook just runs in your browser. And the canvas here is where your component is going to live. So that can be anything. And the great thing about it is it's basically just an iframe. So you have complete control over the page and the data that the component receives. And that is the whole idea behind Storybook. You put basically user interface becomes a function of just data and the template or the component logic. And there is no way less context that's relevant here. And cataloging variants and states is a big deal in Storybook. That's basically what it's all about when you build a storybook. And you might think, well, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to catalog variants and states? What does it even mean? Well, before I get into that, know that thousands of teams across the world use Storybook. Storybook is not a new thing. It's been around for many years. And it really is used by the big names. So all the names you see here, they have published storybooks. They use this to collaborate within their teams, but also to the outside world. Some of these, or many of these actually, are open source. So if you would want to build a website that looks like a BBC website, you can use their Stamina design system and build something that looks exactly like a BBC website. But the same thing goes with all these big things. But variants, right? So what does it even mean? So comparing component variants is what we call stories. Stories is the leading concept the main concept in Storybook, hence the name Storybook. But what are stories? So they're variants of your component. What you can think about there is states. So say you have a user interface component, it might be in a loading state because the data isn't there yet. It might be disabled, in progress, it might be an error, but there's also functional state, right? So have a toggle switch and it can be on or off, or a collapsible component can be open or closed, whatever, right? A modal can be open or closed, or whatever you concoct in your user interface. But that's not all, right? You have to deal. You can deal with the edge cases, right? I have very long text or no text at all, big or small images or extreme numbers. What happens if I throw €1,000,000 in my shopping cart? Does it work, right? Does it overflow weirdly? Does it no longer print the last remaining zeros, right? Maybe that breaks and people would be checking out way more money than they think they are, right? Missing data, so something might not exist that you expect there to exist, or special characters, of course, right? Different languages, whatever. If you put Russian in there, does it still work correctly? Or right to left text, right? Things like that. So if you want to build resilient user interfaces, you need to deal with all these situations, right? Especially if it's going to be a component that will be used in all kinds of systems that you have no control over or limited control over. And then finally, there's context. So I mentioned you want to eliminate context in Storybook really, but still your user interface components will need to be designed in a way that they take that into account. So a user might be signed in or signed out. They might have a different language than English or Dutch, right? They might prefer a dark theme these days on their computer, right? Do you design your user interface components to deal with that? Maybe. Or they might be on the left or right-hand side of an A/B test. And then it gets more complicated because there can be countless combinations of all of these things, right? Of course, you don't want to model out and write down all of the various combinations. It gets unwieldy, right? And close next to impossible. But certainly there are logical combinations that make sense in the context of your system, your application, right? That you should actually document and spec out. So speccing that out is where component story format comes in. Component story format is an open specification pioneered by Storybook that allows you to define these stories. I'll show you an example in a moment. But what's great about component story format being an open specification is that more and more tools are actually adopting this standard. And that means that not only can you use it in Storybook, you can also use it to test with Jest or throw it into Axe for accessibility testing and all that sort of thing. And the reason that's super easy to do is because it's basically vanilla JavaScript. There is no special syntax here. Syntax is just JavaScript or TypeScript if you prefer. So here's what that looks like in just vanilla JavaScript. Say we have a badge component. It's like the most boring component I could think of besides a button. A badge is basically like this pill-shaped thing with some text in it, right? Or a number often. So say I have a badge that says hello world, and the way that the story specification works is typically you have the component name .stories.js or TS as the file name, so it lives beside the component file itself, right? It's a sibling to the other file. You import the badge here because that's the one that we want to specify, write a specification for. We say this is a component, and we specify some metadata is the default export in this file. So, and that's just it's just an object. So there is, again, no special syntax here. It's just a JavaScript object that we happen to export from this file. In this case, I'm specifying some arguments because it needs a label, and I don't want to repeat that label each time. So it's just going to be hello world. And then this component happens to have two variants. There's a big one and there's a small one. Really. And for both of those, I'm writing a story. So I have two stories, a small story and a large story, and really the only difference between them is the property size that they receive. Right? So I have a small one and the large one. It's pretty simple. Again, plain JavaScript, so you can import it in wherever place you want, and a lot of different systems support this out of the box. What's new in the latest version of Storybook that we are releasing, Storybook 6.4, are interactive stories. So what's an issue with the situation that I described before is that you can't always specify a component state using just those args, right? Just data. Most of the time, that is preferable, right? I want to pass data into my component, and that makes it render in a specific way. But sometimes you have a user interface component that requires the user to type in some text into an input box and then click a button before it does something, right? Not everything can be expressed in data alone. So that's what interactive stories are about. A lot of people in the community struggled with this, and so we went ahead and built something for that. So that's what a new concept in the latest version of Storybook is the play function, and I'll show an example in a moment. That allows you to define stories for more complicated components. Say you have a component that is nested inside another component, or you even have an entire page, right? You might have a web application or website, and you're building complete pages in Storybook. That's done more and more these days. But of course, a page is built from a bunch of other components. Well, what if I want to change some information on one of those components? Well, putting in data into the page does not necessarily trigger the component in a certain state. So that's where indirections will help. The way that we do it is by simulating user behavior in the browser. And we didn't invent any of this. In fact, we're building on top of the shoulders of giants here. People in the front-end development world are likely familiar with testing library. So testing library is the most popular choice these days for unit testing UI components. And we are just bringing that experience of using testing library for testing into the browser. And that will unlock a whole bunch of very interesting things. What we're also working on and releasing soon is an ESLint plugin to make it super easy to write this stuff so that you don't make mistakes. So let's dive into some actual code. So I'm going to be programming here for a bit. And I want to show you what that looks like. Actually, I should drop this code, if you shouldn't be seeing it yet. A bit more. Let's hope that still fits then. There. Fine. So what I've done here is actually, I should save my stuff, of course. Right. Empty state. I have prepared an example component, and it happens to be a sign-up form for something, right? The Storybook community. It asks for an email and a password, but this happens to be a component that I cannot control by passing in props, knowing I have to actually interact with this form in order to be able to submit it. So what I'm going to be doing is I want to write a story with the state filled in, right? So the way that we do that is we write a new story, which is basically an export for const say filled, and the story here is just a JavaScript object. For people who are already familiar with writing stories in Storybook, this syntax here is slightly different than what you're used to. This is component Storybook story format version 3, which is coming. Actually, you can already currently use in the latest version of Storybook, but will be the new default in 7.0. But I'm using it already because I want to be using the latest and greatest, of course. So what we do here is we define a story called filled, and if I just save this, by the way, you'll see there's a new story. So I'm going to click that, and nothing happened, right? Because it's also empty. I want to define a play function, and a play function is just an async function. In this case, an arrow function that I define as a property on this object. And now inside this play function, I can start to create user interactions. So what I want to do is I want to type some text into that email field. For that, I'm going to pull in testing library. I don't want to write that stuff all out, but this is what that looks like. I'm importing user event waveform within. You'll see what I need them for from Storybook/testing library. If you happen to already know testing library, of course, Storybook/testing library is not the official original testing library. It is our wrapper around their library. So that's also an open source thing, right? We just wrap it, and you'll see why. So I'm importing that, and in my play function, first off, I want to start by targeting the story canvas, right? That's that area here. The way that I do that is I can retrieve the canvas element from what I receive on my play function, and then const canvas equals within the canvas element. Canvas. Right. So, and then I could say user event. I think it's super obnoxious. User event dot, yeah, that's because of the screen resolution. You know what? Oh, user event.type, and I want to type into an element, right? So that element I can select using canvas.get by something. There's various options here. I'm not quite sure how I want to retrieve this element. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring up my DevTools here, inspect this element, this email field right there, and look at the DOM structure of it. And it seems to have a data test ID email. Right, I guess I can use that. So get by test ID. Ah, it exists. Email, right? Email. And I'm just going to type in a value saying hello, and see what happens. There you go. Right? It just refreshed automatically. I saved my file, refreshed automatically. Bam. Hello is over there. Actually, now I can put this in that side. That's a great thing. So there. Side by side doesn't really work. It turns out. So I want obviously also want to type in the other one. So I'm going to say user and type into the let's go inspect password obviously. World super safe password, right? And then it's filled in. Great. What's interesting here, you also see that the stuff that I've written in code is also displayed here, right? So this is the interactions panel. That's the new thing with the interactions add-on that we're introducing. You get this panel, so that makes it much easier to debug these tests that you're writing. So, and that all just runs in the browser. There's no special software involved here. So in case you happen to know Cypress, you don't need to install any stuff like that. You just get it in your browser, right? But basically it's the same thing. And this is what I get when I fill it in. Let's see what happens when I click this button. Oops. So obviously my email address is invalid and my password is also invalid. Right? I can actually hover over this thing here, and I need minimum 6 characters. But this is interesting. This might very well be a state that I want to test, right? Because this is a distinct state in my application that I want to know what it looks like and verify it in the future that it doesn't break, right? So what I can actually do is also start writing a story, export const invalid, that tests that particular state. So the way that I do it, I write a play function again, async arrow function like that. It receives the context. In this case, I'm not going to destructure it. And what I can do here is I don't want to repeat myself, right? I don't want to write the same code again. But this being vanilla JavaScript and all, I can just do failed.play, give it the context, and of course I have to await it because it's a promise, right? It's an asynchronous function, which reminds me I forgot to put the await over here. It worked anyway, but it's important. And carry on doing my thing. So I want this context canvas element, and now I want to click that button, right? So I'm going to say await user event, click, no, not clear, click on the button canvas. Get by role. Button. I want the button, but whichever button. Give me the first one. It probably might not work. Let's see what happens. And see what that. I got a new story, invalid. Run it. Oh, boom! It's failing. It's failing. Why? Well, I found multiple elements with the roll button. Right, the reset button. Thought that might happen. Name. Well, it just takes a regular expression, so create, whatever, something that contains create. Click it. Boom. So I have a story now that when I run it, I can refresh it in case you missed it here. It actually clicks that button, right? And then that triggers the error state that I've seen before. I no longer need to manually click it. It's just created it for me. Let's see what I can do with this thing, right? You can also hover over this thing to show the tooltip. Well, totally we can do that. Await user event, hover over canvas, get element by, I don't know, what's this little thing here? Oh, it's got a data test ID. Copy it, get by test ID. There, boom, hover it. Does it work? No. Unable to find. Oh, right. So this is an interesting situation. This is pretty common when you write tests like these against a live component, right? You interact with it, but sometimes you expect something to be there and it's not there yet. It's going to be there, but it's not there yet because the button click triggered some process that takes a couple milliseconds and then comes back, right? Promises, asynchronous processes. So what we can do there is we can actually wrap this piece of logic into a what we call a wait for, which takes a function and then we can invoke it. Does it work now? Does it work now? That works. What you actually saw for a brief moment there. When I refresh it, can I trigger it? Well, slight brief moment, it's red, right? And then it turns green. So what it does, it fails initially, and then it tries again, and then it succeeds. So that's what the wait for actually does. This is not something that's new. This is part of testing library. I did not invent any of that. This is just the way it works. So now I can actually test also that hover state so that it shows my minimum 6 characters requirement. So far this is, I'm pretty confident about it. I'm pretty happy with this. So let's jump back into my slides and look at this. So to recap first, this is what in essence it looks like to write an interactive story. Right? So we have our metadata there, we have our play function here, and we're simulating some events on the canvas, right? And what's important to note is that you need to use the Storybook wrapper for testing libraries, because that is what enables this panel, this debugger, to show the interactions. What's more, and what's actually coming in the near future, is interaction testing, to make assertions about the state of the component, and that being jest compatible. So people who are already familiar with jests, it's the same syntax. In fact, it is jest. We bring an in-browser debugger. You've already kind of seen it. But also a Node.js test runner, so that you can run these tests in a continuous integration system, or on your local machine, run all the tests, and reproduce any errors by getting just a URL. And you can, in fact, send that URL to a colleague, and they should be able to reproduce the error as well. Let's jump back. Continue down this road. What I actually now want to do is make some assertions about the state of my component. So I'm also going to create a new story for the actual success situation, right? So export, const, submit it. So where it did submit, play, an async function. So again, could copy and paste this, but good type. And in this case, I'm just going to copy and paste rather than use the previous one, because that one was not what I wanted. Give me that canvas element, and now I'm just really going. So Gert at chromatic.com, right? A valid email address and super secret password, right? And now I will submit it. So click that button down there, click it, and I'm not going to do the hover thing again. But now, actually, I got a submitted thing, and you see it clicked the button, it started spinning, and oh, it's done. This is an animated component, right? It does something when it's submitted. It just happens to do that. What I can also do is actually expect, which comes from jest, expect args.onSubmit I need to grab ours, to have been called. People who know jests and write unit tests like that, they are probably familiar with to have been called as a way to assert that a function has been invoked, right? So what's this thing? So my component that I just define up here, that component takes an onSubmit callback function. And what I did is through metadata, I said this onSubmit is an action, which is a concept. It's actually another add-on in Storybook. You can mark something as being an action. And there's this tab here, Actions, where you can see the log of all the actions that have been invoked. And what we, I need to import it first. Let's fix that from storybook/jest. So I've marked it as being an action, and that puts that invocation in the log. But I can also just make assertions about the fact that it was invoked. The reason is that anything that's marked as an action, we are automatically creating a jest mock function or spy for it. There is no setup involved beyond marking it as an action. It just works. So that's pretty cool. Jumping back into my interactions, I can assert that when I run it, it should have been called. Didn't. Async. Oh wait. Wait for. Same situation, right? I'm using a form library, Formic, and it does asynchronous validation. And that's why it takes a little while for it to trigger the onSubmit handler after you click the button, right? So I just wrap it in a wait for, and I expect it to have been called. Does it work now? Bam, it works. You can have them, of course, you can like assert the arguments it has been called with and such. But now I can actually test and verify that my component does what it's supposed to do. I could even go further and now make assertions about the fact that this text appears on screen, for example, or that there is a back button and that it does what it's supposed to do. In fact, good practice there is to create a new story for that. Use this play function composition, aka invoking the play function from a previous story and a new story, so that you don't repeat yourself, and then write some additional assertions. So you have separate stories for those separate steps in the workflow, so to say, this wizard of sorts. Right. So again, to recap, what this gives you is assertions, automatic spies on any actions, and again, it's important that you use the Storybook wrapper for jest. What I totally forgot to show you, which is maybe even more interesting, is what you can do is click one of these things here, and it'll pause right at that step, right? It has paused this step of interactions right at that point, and I can, of course, use my dev tools as I want. Like I'm just looking at the current state of the DOM here. I can make do all kinds of checks. Like my test is my interactions is failing. Why doesn't it work? Something changed. What changed? Oh, the test ID has changed. Maybe, I don't know. So you can step back and forth through this list of things. I should not have done this because this is a running bug, but it's experimental software, right? But you get the gist, right? You can click through these things back and forth, run to the end, rerun it, what you want. And that is what it makes it super powerful. All right, so maybe by now you're wondering, how did they pull this off, right? Well, magic. No, it's not magic, of course. So what we're actually doing is runtime introspection and interception. That might sound like what? Basically, you call that function, we call through to the original function by testing library or expect. But we also log the fact that you did so and send an event to the add-on panel so that it can show it in the log. so that it's tracking the methods in those method invocations. And then when you are debugging or stepping through, it actually returns, it just intercepts that function. It doesn't run the original function that you wanted to run. Instead, it just returns a promise. And that promise will not resolve until you click next. So that's what allows us to pause in the middle of running that play function. And which is also the reason why you need to await, put the await keyword in front of each of those things. That is a minor nuisance that you need to await them, but really, I think it looks kind of clean too. And then there's a final trick in that when, say you are paused in the middle of a play function and you switch to a different story, what you want to do is abort the currently running play function altogether. Don't run anything what comes next. Well, how do you exit a running function in JavaScript? You throw, right? So what we do, we throw, but we don't want to show like a huge error on screen, boom, it blew up. So we actually throw a specific type of silent exception that is caught by Storybook as a general concept. That's in the core of Storybook now. And it catches that exception and it logs it, but doesn't do anything other than that, right? It doesn't show a big error on screen that it would otherwise do. Let's look at how we are doing on time. So it's 9, so I'm just gonna carry on. So coming soon is, I mentioned before, is this test runner for Node.js. Because obviously you don't just want to run tests in your browser alone, right? You want to develop those tests in your browser, be able to debug them, etc. But of course, the functionality of tests is that you run them continuously in an integration system before you push to production, right? So the test runner that we're working on, basically what it does is it takes those play functions and converts them into a jest unit test that you can then run in a CI system, and that tests across all the stories in your entire storybook rather than just the one that you happen to be looking at. It runs locally or in CI using a headless browser. And then you can actually, when it throws an error, this is a random screenshot, not the actual thing, it gives you a URL that you can click to show the error in a real browser rather than a headless browser so that you can debug it again. And finally, we are building in reporting so that you can integrate it with other tools. So, for example, in Circle CI, you will see a nice list of errors rather than mumbo jumbo that you see over there. So, to wrap up, stories, in a way, in Storybook have always been tests, right? Writing out a specification for what your component can do, and then basically looking through the components that you have is a way to test them. But visually inspecting whether a component looks right is just one piece of the puzzle, right? And visual testing is what Chromatic does, by the way. We take those screenshots, remember? And then we compare them pixel by pixel over time. So that's covered. But what we are working on, and the first step there is interaction testing, is way more ways that stories are tests. So accessibility is something that there's already an accessibility add-on in Storybook, but reporting on those things in your CI environment is something that's coming in the near future. Composition, so of course components are composed out of other components. We want to test those things. And then entire user flows, you've seen some of that already, right? Basically, a sign-up form is a flow in a way, right? So that is all getting unlocked with interaction testing. And if you would like to know more about this, follow me on Twitter. I occasionally tweet about these things. And thanks for your attention.
Hello, it's me again. Are there any questions? No one has any questions? So it must be a perfect talk now.
That was completely clear. Yeah.
Very nice.
People are scared. Oh, there's one.
Oh, sorry, there's one question.
So the test ID attribute, that's inherent to Storybook then, or?
No, it just happens to be in this component.
All right.
So, in fact, testing by retrieving an element by test ID is a bit of a hack. There are the best practices there is to pick something that's stable, and test ID is of course stable. But you like using a button label is slightly less stable, but might be more resilient to change in a way. So it depends on the component whether or not you are using those attributes. But getting it by a role, for example, is a pretty good way to go about it. And it's actually, so the testing library has a ton of recommendations. They wrote articles about it and how to do this type of testing reliably, so that when you refactor some code or you change the looks of your component, that your test won't break. Okay? And test ID is one trick in the toolbox.
Okay, thanks.